Hello guys! As a latest project I was trying to make a PC that I can use in a car. For that I need a fairly economic motherboard that is half decent and a power supply that will be able to run that motherboard. As a power supply I have found over Amazon something that runs of 12 volts and delivers 300 watts. At least that is what they say. Today I will be unboxing this power supply and also review it with you. Please note that I am not a professional, I am just a hobbyist that is messing about. Any complaints, leave them for someone else. Instructive comments will be welcomed. Now let us go over to the Amazon website to show you what I am using and compare a bit the prices so you will know what you are getting yourself in. The power supply can be found under the name Pico PSU or Pico PSU 300 watts. If you scroll down you will see it here. As you can see, is a bit pricey, being sold at £46. This is the price that I have paid on it, but it was with Prime shipping. The power supply is advertised with all cables but no power adapter. So please make sure that you keep that in mind, as it can be an extra expense. Here you have all the information needed about the power supply. They state that the power supply is suitable for mini IDX, but assume that should do well also with the motherboard that I have. My motherboard is in micro ATX running an AMD A10 processor, and you can see it above my keyboard. If we go back you will find the power supply also at cheaper prices like £27 or even cheaper. The price is all over the place, but still you cannot choose it because of the price. All that this supposed to do is offer you the advantage of running a full PC of 12 volts, but yeah, the price is a bit steep. I personally don't find the price attractive. Now let's open another tab and see what we can find if we don't need a 12 volts power supply. It looks that for the same price or even lower we can get a full 600 watts power supply. This is a 600 watts EVGA that I have used in the past and they are absolutely brilliant. If you don't need the small factor power supply or you have access to a power plug, I would not bother with the Pico power supply. I am very curious to see how will it perform and the quality of the product. If we switch over to eBay we will see that the prices are not that different. They are still between £20+ and £40+. I actually forgot to specify that this power supplies can be found ranging from 150 watts all the way up to 400 watts. From what I know, the bigger the wattage on the power supply, the more amps you need to have on your 12 volts power adapter. If you are using this of your car battery, I assume that will be quite juicy, so I would personally put a backup battery. I actually think that I will also try running it of a car battery just for fun and see how it behaves. Now that I have told you where to get it and what to expect in terms of pricing, let's get to it and see what I got for my money. The box is a cheap unmarked box, just as you get when you order on Wish or AliExpress. It has come in an Amazon box for proving some sort of authenticity or something. Absolutely nothing special about it. The only markings on the box are probably a product ID that states LDA300W and a barcode that again undersays the product PC PSU DC12V and so on. Now I don't know if, when I refer to these power supplies, I am making a mistake by referring to them as Pico power supply or not. But I have discovered them being called Pico, I will continue calling them Pico. If you open the box you will see that is separated, and on one side you have your wiring and on the other you have the power supply. I will try to zoom so you will have a better view of what I am doing. That's it. A bit better. The wiring is fairly intuitive. You get a 20-pin ATX power connector to a 24-pin ATX, plus on the 24-pin connector you also have the 4-pin connector separately wired. The 24-pin connector is actually a 20+4. In the eventuality that you have a motherboard with only 20 pins, that comes in handy. I personally have not seen a 20-pin motherboard in quite a while. From the 24-pin connector you have a Molex connector as power for older hard drives. A SATA connector perfect for hard drives and solid-state drives, and a 4-pin connector. The next cable is a SATA 4-pin to SATA 4-pin, and this can be used for power as well. We also have the 12 volts connector to 4-pin where the adapter goes to and plugs into the power supply. The power supply is in a separate compartment in the box covered with bubble wrap. Again proving us the extra length that they went to keep it cheap. The PCB looks fairly cheap. In the middle you can see the 20-pin ATX connector and the 4-pin ATX connector. The power input for the power adapter is on the left lower corner. Now we will be putting it all together. The 20-pin ATX connector goes in the 20-pin socket on the power supply. As you can see, and then we have the 4-pin ATX cable in 4-pin socket from the power supply. All we have left now is the power adapter connector. Please pay attention to the orientation of all sockets so you won't cause any damage. On the power adapter connector, the green wire I assume that is the ground that will be on the case. Well, this is how it all looks connected. No troubles up to here. Now I will talk a bit about what I will be using to test the 12 volts power supply. I assume that you also want to see it in action. The 12 volts power supply didn't have any manual or leaflet to explain what is the story with it, so I had to learn it the hard way. I have started testing it with this 12 volts 4 amps DC adapter. Obviously did not work. The amperage of the DC adapter or converter has to be quite high. 4 amps are just not enough. The connector from the DC adapter, it has to be the right size, as a normal 5.5 millimeters with 2.1 middle does not work. When I have seen that I need higher amperage, I have turned to my old good friend the 600 watts power supply and turned it into a DC adapter. First I have tried the redneck way. A 24-pin female ATX connector. Connected that to the 600 watts power supply and jump-started it. That has actually done the trick, and I have seen life in the old PC but didn't like the look of it. Also had a few sparks that convinced me is not the way forward. Then I have come across this little toy that is actually brilliant. This is a breakout board from 24-pin ATX to different voltages. Huge potential into this one, as it lets you use the 600 watts power supply as a bench power supply. In this breakboard you have everything, offering you a range from 3.3 volts to 24 volts. The board is very simple, only creating a fused bridge to the ammeter. Next to me I also have an ammeter that will help us to see the amperage and wattage pulled by the 12 volts power supply. Connected to the ammeter I have a 120 watts DC to DC converter that will be used as a regulator when we will be testing the power supply running on the battery. The input range on the regulator is from 8 volts up to 40 volts, and the output is 12 volts 10 amps. We will not need the regulator until we will run the 12 volts power supply of the car battery. The monitor that I will be using is an Asus MB168B that runs of USB at 5 volts. I am also curious the amperage that the monitor pulls at 5 volts, and because of that I will have it connected to this 5 volts ammeter. The motherboard is a MSIA 68 HM Micro ATX with 16 gigs of DDR3 and an AMD A10 processor. Now is time to move along and start testing the thing. The motherboard has a voltage tolerance of 5% to 10%. Because of that I usually check the power adapter. Let us get some voltages and see what we have on the breakboard. The first slot has negative 11.54 volts. That is actually the negative that allows you to reach 24 volts. Second slot reads 12.35 volts. Third slot reads 4.98 volts. And now we have the 3.34 volts on the last slot. I kept rechecking the first slot as I was expecting to be a bit closer to negative 12 volts. Now I will be connecting the ammeter to the breadboard. The wiring that I am using will do for testing but not for the long run. Please note that the 12 volts power supply is rated at 300 watts. That converted to amps is about 25. For 25 amps we need at least a 8 gauge wire. Using the wrong wires will cause overheating and is a fire hazard. The connectors are important as well. Same problem, if they cannot hold the amperage, they will overheat. Now with the ammeter connected to the breadboard, it's time to see if all works okay. First I check that there are no loose wires to cause sparks and then we go for it. The rough look of the ammeter is because I didn't manage yet to make a case for it. On the ammeter we have a reading of 12.38 volts with no consumers yet. Time to connect the 12 volts power supply to the motherboard. The 24-pin ATX connector goes in the 24-pin socket on the motherboard. As always, I have trouble connecting it first time. Then we have two options. We can use the 4-pin connector that comes straight from the power supply or the extension from the 24-pin. I assume that any would do just fine. I will use the extension as I would like as less wiring as possible. After this is time to connect the SSD. Now I am removing the 4-pin connector from the motherboard as I don't need it and it keeps the view a bit more clear. Let us add the monitor in the eventuality that it starts and we need to see that we see. The monitor is plugged via a mini ammeter that will show us what it pulls of the motherboard. The full circuit is composed by the 600 watts power source, followed by the breakboard, followed by the ammeter, followed by the 12 volts power source that powers the motherboard. Now let us run it and see what happens. We turn on the breakboard and we can see that the ammeter is showing us activity. I will also try to move the monitor so you can see it. The reason for the long start time is that the monitor is running off USB, so the Windows has to load and start the drivers. The ammeter reads 12 volts and the amperage is about 6 amps at start and then varies between 4 amps and 6 amps at idle. I will keep checking the wires as they are not even close to what I should have for this project. Unfortunately, are the only ones that I currently have. As we all know, the power consumption varies when you start putting load on the motherboard's components. To increase the power consumption, I will start stressing the CPU. To do that, I will be using MSI Afterburner with Combustor CPU burner. The A10 CPU has 4 cores. I will start adding one by one the cores in the burner so we can see the power consumption difference. When I'm stressing one core, the difference is not massive. Now I went for 2 cores being stressed and the power consumption jumped up to 9 amps. As I was saying before, the wiring that I am using is not suitable for this, and you can tell that by touching. It keeps getting warmer. The connector on the 12 volts power supply also gets warmer. Not all wires get warm. The ones supporting higher amperage are still okay to touch. Now I will go for all cores being stressed. The amperage spiked at 11.50 amps and the voltage dropped at 11.72. The wires are getting really hot. They should do the trick for short periods of time, but not for long at full burst. The 4-pin connector on the 12 volts power supply is getting hot as well. That is a sign to me that no way on earth will support a full 300 watts, bearing in mind that right now at 11 amps we pull about 132 watts. Now that I have stopped the stress test on the CPU, the amperage dropped to 9.1 and the wires started to cool down a bit. Keeping an eye on the ammeter, I can see that keeps dropping down to 5.5 amps. The monitor shows a power consumption of 1.2 amps at 5 volts. The wires finally dropped to an acceptable temperature. It seems that the power supply it actually works. It holds a stable system running at maximum power, at least on this configuration. But I don't think it will support a full 300 watts. I have my doubts about the connectors and wiring used, at least the power input. There are other concerns that I have. In my testings that you cannot see in this video with different power supplies, I have noticed that the 12 volts is actually not regulated. Whatever the DC converter outputs you will see at the 12 volts end of the power supply. This makes me think that if you have spikes in the power going in the 12 volts supply, you might encounter some fried computer parts. Finally, I have managed to finish the case for my ammeter and also remake the wiring. Instead of 1 wire, I have used 3 wires, and that should help with the wire's overheating problem. I will try increasing the power consumption on my test rig by adding a few more components. Above my ammeter I have a RAID controller board and a couple SAS drives that I will connect to my test rig. I will try adding also some USB consumers and see how much we can push it. The power converter that you can see here is a 12 volts 33 amperes AC to DC. Is one of them cheap converters that you can find over eBay or Amazon, but they have the juice that I need. For the wiring on the converter, I have used 2 wires on each output, so I will make sure that it holds the amperage. While I was waiting for the 12 volts 30 amperes power adapter, I have managed to 3D print a case for the ammeter and also remake the wiring. Earlier in the video, I have said that the wires start to heat up because of the amperage. When I have remade the wiring, I have used 3 wires instead of 1. That should allow me to test further without the wires heating up. Now let's do a test with this power converter and my new cased ammeter and see where we stand. Hopefully we will have no fire coming out. At the test rig startup we again can see a mild drop in the voltage and the amperage fluctuating between 6 and 4 amps. The connectors and the wiring seems to hold nicely without overheating. Now that everything seems in order, it's time to start stressing the test rig again. As soon as we started the stress test, the amperage spiked up to 9 and the wattage to 110. My biggest worry is the wires overheating again. Now I will turn the rig off and add the RAID controller and the hard drives. Now with everything connected, it's time to double check and start the rig again. I had to suspend the motherboard as the metal support from the RAID controller was pushing it out. Now the amperage boot peak is at 9.6 amps. All good and running. Now I will check that the RAID card has loaded and that we can see the newly added drives. The drives are there but not initiated. I was thinking to use the cipher command to keep the drives busy, but I just realized that they need formatting. That will keep them busy as well. Now leaving the drives running the format, I will start the combustor to peak the power consumption. The amperage spiked at 11.30 or 136 watts and keeps increasing too. After I have plugged also the USB SSD, the power consumption went up to 12.07 amps or 145 amps. On the wiring part, all seems acceptable apart from the plug between the ammeter and power supply. The wires are a bit warm, but not to the point that I would find dangerous. Here I also have a NVIDIA GT 1030 graphics card that I am hoping is going to pull more power of the motherboard. I am desperately trying to make the power consumption to go over 200 watts. Up to now I have only managed 144, so I will need to keep trying. All in and ready to go. Let's start it and see what happens. The GPU is plugged in and also both monitors, the USB monitor, and also the desktop monitor. The amperage at boot starts around 6.83 and goes up to 9 plus. After the system stabilizes, keeps to 9 amps for a few seconds and then drops to 5-6 amps. Now is time for the stress test. This time we will stress both video card as well as the CPU. With only the GPU stress, it peaks at 9 amps. I will start now also the CPU burner on all 4 cores to see the peak. It peaks at 11.9 plus amps, even 12 amps. 142 watts. The connectors start feeling a bit warm to the touch. Due to the connectors on the power supply, I could not put a full-size GTX or RTX video card on the test rig as I had no way of powering it. Now as a last test, I will connect the power supply also to a car battery and see if it is enough to run it. In my opinion, the only reason why I would use this kind of power supply is to make the system as mobile as possible. Up to now we have seen what it can do on a AC to DC power adapter, so why not on battery? To be able to run it safely, I recommend that you use this DC to DC converter that also has the role of DC stabilizer. It converts between 8 and 40 volts to stable 12V 10 amps. The amperage usually varies with the voltage outputted by the battery. Please note that a car battery when fully charged has 13 volts plus and slowly drops. When starting a vehicle and the battery is connected, you have a spike in the voltage, and this serves as a protection as well. Now that we have connected the DC regulator to the battery, we can see the voltage on the ammeter. The test rig is now fully connected. Let's turn it on to see what we get. We get the same amperage spike up to 7.5 on boot. The DC regulator should easily keep it running. It looks like it runs quite well. Looking at the amperage, it seems that it varies a little bit more than before, but still keeping around 5-6 amps. The voltage keeps all right. It holds around 12 volts. Apart from that, we can also see that it pulls also about 70 to 90 watts. Now let us also do the stress test. This will let us know if the 10 amperes held by the DC regulator will be enough to hold the rig. I will start again the CPU burner from the MSI combustor on all 4 cores. Just as expected. It goes up to 9 amps while the voltage drops a little bit more. It looks that it can run of a car battery as long as you have the right DC regulator. I actually kept it running for quite a while and it has behaved well. When the battery voltage dropped quite low, and by low I mean next to 9 volts, the PC went off. The reason for that is that the regulator could not provide more than 4 amps of current. To be able to get the full 10 amps of the regulator, the voltage that goes in has to be 12 volts or more. When it drops under 12 volts, then the output voltage keeps nearly the same, but the amperage drops. After finishing with all these tests, I have made myself an idea about what is what. Would I use one of these? Not really. It is an expensive product compared with what you can get from a regular power supply. Also involves other expenses apart from only paying for the power supply. You need also a power adapter or a DC regulator depending on the use. If you want to build a microcomputer, it might do well. If you don't have a suitable power source of at least 10 amperes is not okay. To reach the full potential of the power supply you need at least 25 amperes, and for that the wiring on the power supply is not suitable. If you were to run the power supply at 25 amps continuously, is going to start overheating the cables and will become a fire hazard. You have seen in the video that even if you struggle to go over 160 watts is not easy. With 2 extra hard drives and a PCI Express card plus USB dongles and external SSDs, and I have barely managed to get next to 150 watts. Out there are other Pico power supplies that take less space than this one and do the same thing and probably also cost less. On the power supply you don't have enough connectors to add more consumers, and I actually don't think you need more. I personally did not manage to take the power supply over 150 watts due to the lack of consumers that I can connect to a PC. If you can do better, send me the link. I am curious. Thank you very much for watching this. I hope it has been helpful, and if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them.